Yeah, Bev, he was kind of the compromise candidate in a way who was chosen by the Communist Party elders just after the turmoil of the Tiananmen Square crackdown to take the helm of the world's most populous nation. And of course, for those initial years, China really was in the international doghouse, at least with Western countries, because of the outcry over the military ending those protests in Tiananmen. But got to give it to Jiang Zemin. He did a pretty good job in the 1990s of gradually building relations with Western countries to the point where by 2001, China got something it had its eyes on for quite a while, entry into the World Trade Organization. And this allowed the Chinese state to trade more freely with countries from Australia to the US and everywhere in between. Took off as a result. So Jiang Zemin, not regarded as one of the three big leaders of China since Mao, kind of one of the more forgotten men in a way, but he was in power for well over a decade, and it was a very different time to today's China.
And he was quite a colourful character, Bill, and, you know, he sort of was he had really warm relations with the West towards the end. How was he viewed in the country itself?
Yeah, an incredibly different character to his two successors, Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping. Jiang Zemin wasn't afraid to engage with the foreign media. He sat down with the US version of 60 Minutes in a very famous interview with Mike Wallace. He even recited the Gettysburg Address partly in English to kind of show, I suppose, what a cosmopolitan guy he was. At one point, when the Hong Kong press pack came to Beijing, he engaged with the journalists in this very famous exchange, which frankly was a little bit embarrassing because he kind of prattled on, but he accused the Hong Kong journalists of being too simple and too naive. This has been a very famous video ever since. And he really was a lot more accessible. He wasn't exactly doing press conferences every week or anything, but a lot more accessible in the public eye compared to his immediate successor, Hu Jintao, and then particularly to today's leader, Xi Jinping, who has so much distance between him and the media, him and the people. So Jiang Zemin remembered fondly for those sorts of things. Certainly not remembered fondly by practitioners, for example, of Falun Gong, the practice that he cracked down on in the late 1990s. Probably a bit of a debatable legacy with people down in the Three Gorges part of China, where Jiang Zemin oversaw this massive hydro dam. So, you know, he definitely had controversies, but ultimately he was a leader who helped get China back on the map after the Tiananmen crackdown, helped build back those relations, presided over a time when the Chinese economy was growing, got China into the WTO, definitely a sort of warmer, more optimistic relationship with the West compared to what there is now. And I think for those reasons, Bev, he will be remembered somewhat fondly, particularly with these protests that are going on at the moment.
Yeah, and you know, as you point out, the timing of his death is very interesting when you consider it was Tiananmen when he took over, and now we're seeing protests that we haven't seen in 30 years. And as you say, it's a very tense time. People are starting to turn a little against Xi Jinping.
Yeah, now we have to obviously say that the protests Xi Jinping has been facing over the past week, much smaller than the Tiananmen protests that the Communist Party faced in the late 1980s. But that's partly a reflection of just how much more repressive it is now. The state has the tools of surveillance and the domestic security apparatus to make sure even if there was a more widespread feeling of discontent, that people don't have the ability to gather and protest for a sustained period of time. So one thing I do believe Xi Jinping and the Communist Party leadership would be worried about with the death of Jiang Zemin is that either online or even in some sort of, public gatherings, if there are going to be any more of them, people might remember him and they might sort of contrast his relative openness compared to Xi Jinping as a form of protest. It'll be very interesting to watch, Bev, in the coming days, just how tightly the internet censors try to control the narrative about Jiang Zemin, how much they allow those videos of him singing, of him cracking jokes, of him talking to journalists, how much of that will be allowed to fly around the Chinese internet, because compared to Xi Jinping, it is a pretty obvious contrast.
Indeed. Great to talk, Bill. Thanks so much.
Thanks.